Hello everyone, and welcome to the Pokémon Speculation Station. I have a more serious video, plus a fun trivia/game show type video in the works, both of which are taking longer to complete than I anticipated. But I thought I'd try to get a video out before then, and what better casual topic to use than speculation about Gen 5 remakes following the 2025 Pokémon Day Direct. So grab a Castelia Cappuccino or a Lumiose Latte and join me for the Pokémon Speculation Station. Are Gen 5 remakes being skipped? Fans have speculated about Gen 5 remakes being skipped since Pokémon Legends ZA's announcement in 2024. And honestly, I get it. We are used to Pokémon games that take place in previous regions releasing in order. It was unreasonable to expect Gen 3 to be remade before Gens 1 and 2, for example. So when Legends ZA, a Kalos, aka Gen 6-centric game, was announced, fans naturally started to wonder if Gen 5 remakes had just been skipped over. And now that the 2025 Pokémon Day Direct announced a new, kind of main series, kind of spin-off game, Pokémon Champions, and didn't mention anything about Gen 5 remakes, I'm sure the concerns will continue to rise. Except, I honestly don't think Gen 5 is getting skipped, because Legends games aren't really remakes. If we had gotten Gen 6 remakes announced, then yes, I'd think something was up. But for all intents and purposes, Legends ZA is the next Gen 9 game. It just happens to take place in a different region than Scarlet and Violet, which already takes place in 3 different regions thanks to its DLC. But that prompts the question of why we're getting Legends ZA by itself like this. Why not wait until it's time for Gen 6 remakes and release it after the remakes, like with Brilliant Diamond, Shining Pearl, and Legends Arceus? This is especially relevant now that we know that Legends ZA takes place after X and Y, thanks to the reveal of AZ and his Floette running a hotel. It would make a lot of sense to release a Gen 6 sequel after Gen 6 remakes. I think there are 2 main reasons for this timing. The more interesting of those reasons that I'd like to talk about first is that I think Gen 6 won't be remade at all. Let me explain. I admit this is a pretty wild opinion, that Gen 6 won't be remade when it's one of the games that fans generally believe is the most in need of a remake. But we have to ask ourselves, what are Pokemon game remakes really? How are remakes meaningfully different from their original games? And I think when we answer this question, we'll see why it seems so unlikely that Gen 6, and yes, all the generations after it, have no reason to be remade, even if we believe the games are in need of alteration in some way. So what does Fire Red and Leaf Green do, meaningfully, for the original Gen 1 games? Well, it updates the graphics, it adds new features like the Versus Seeker and Sevi Islands, but the most impactful change is updating the gameplay. Gen 2 introduced the Dark and Steel types and held items, and Gen 3 introduced EVs and IVs to replace DVs, and it introduced abilities and natures. Fire Red and Leaf Green is Gen 1, with a few extra features and, most importantly, all the major gameplay alterations of the following generations. Heart Gold and Soul Silver are the same. It doesn't fix the original game's horrible level curve or distribution of Gen 2 Pokémon. It doesn't even give additional Gen 2 Pokémon to the Johto Gym Leaders. If we distill Heart Gold and Soul Silver down, it's Gen 2 with updated graphics, new features like the Pokeathlon and Pokemon sprites on the overworld, and most importantly, updated gameplay. Heart Gold and Soul Silver get EVs, IVs, abilities, and natures from Gen 3, and the physical special split from Gen 4. There's also an additional benefit from the updated National Pokédex, that being cross-generational evolutions. Although I believe there were too many limitations in place to accessing cross-generational evolutions, it's still impactful when you do eventually get them. Part of the reason why so many Gen 2 Pokemon got cross-generational evolutions was because they desperately needed it. So there's an additional gameplay benefit of playing Gen 2 within Gen 4, when Sneasel can evolve, Piloswine can evolve, Togetic, Gligar, and etc. It may be tempting to say that Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire are drastically different from their originals because of the character redesigns and addition of Mega Evolution, but it's not all that different from previous remakes. Fire Red, Leaf Green, Heart Gold, and Soul Silver all have character redesigns, plus some dialogue changes here and there. In fact, most of the dialogue in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire is actually the same as in the original Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. Again, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire update the original game's graphics, add some new features like DexNav and Soaring, and update the gameplay. In this case, the game gets access to Gen 4's Physical Special Split, and Gen 6's Fairy types, and, luckily, Mega Evolution and National Dex. Because of its access to the National Dex, it gains cross-generational evolutions, including Roserade, Frostlass, Dusknoir, and Gallade, the latter of which was turned into Wally's ace partner and given a Mega Evolution. But this is where things start to get tricky. What does Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl do to change its original games? Well, it updates, it changes the graphics, it adds some new features like character customization, and it adds the gameplay changes of Gens 5, 6, 7, and 8. Kind of. Obviously, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl doesn't have Gen 8's Dynamax gimmick. The reasoning used was that these would be faithful remakes, even though the developers were seemingly fine with unfaithfully changing how Super Contests worked. The thing is, while Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire were lucky enough to get Mega Evolution, these single-generation gimmicks, especially those made after Mega Evolutions, feel clearly made for the purpose of being one and done. I'm not saying this is good or bad, just that Z-moves, Dynamax, and Terastallization all clearly feel like they're meant to be exclusive to one game, whereas Mega Evolutions kind of had the vibe of something that could last longer if feasible. So with the exception of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire's Mega Evolution, we have to treat subsequent gimmicks as just that. Impermanent gimmicks that are laid on top of the primary gameplay, rather than an innate change made to them. So with that in mind, what gameplay changes could Gen 4 remakes get from Gens 5, 6, 7, and 8? Well, it's Fairy type. That's it. The Fairy type is the only major permanent gameplay change the series has seen since Gen 4. Now I'm talking battle mechanics here. Legends Arceus' overworld capturing system and Scarlet and Violet's open world exploration are highly unlikely to be implemented into remakes because, again, that would require too much of an innate change to the structure of the original games. Yes, there's a first time for everything. Theoretically, there could be a Pokemon game remake with Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth level alterations. But it's more reasonable to speculate based on what has happened rather than the literally infinite possibilities of what could happen. Would I love for Gen 5 remakes to be as extensive as something like the Final Fantasy VII Remake series? Of course. Is there anything wrong with wishing for that? Not at all. Is that a reasonable expectation? Sadly, I don't think so. Thus far, the biggest meaningful change between an original Pokemon game and its remakes is in its battle systems. The rest of the game is predominantly the same, and the only change we've gotten since Gen 4's Physical Special Split is the Fairy type in Gen 6. Oh, and Dexit. While Dexit technically didn't hurt Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl as badly, since no Gen 4 Pokemon has gotten a cross-generational evolution yet, it is weird to see the remakes add the Fairy type, but not the cross-generational evolution of Eevee that was literally made to promote that type. Not to mention it's just disappointing overall. So, what could Gen 6 remakes do? Change the graphics, maybe add some new feature here and there. But then what? It already has fairy types. Heck, it already has Mega Evolutions. The gameplay would not change at all. It might not be hit as hard by the lack of a national dex because, like Gen 4, its Pokémon haven't gotten cross-generational evolutions yet, but that just goes to show how little its gameplay would change. The same applies to Gens 7, 8, and 9. Nothing could be added to their gameplay to warrant a remake, because that's always been the most changed element in a remake compared to the original. Now, if some major battle gameplay changes were to happen in the future, then yes, we may see Gens 6 through 9 remade eventually. But as it stands now, I don't think they will. This is a big part of the reason why I think we're getting Legends ZA before Gen 5 remakes. If Gen 6 won't be remade, but it could get a Legends game to explore the Kalos region or Lumiose City from the ground up, then it works as a single game release between Gens 9 and 10, compared to Gen 5, which is more likely to have a remake plus a Legends game, like Gen 4. The second, less exciting but still important reason I think Legends ZA is being released before Gen 5 remakes is that it's just too early for Gen 5 remakes. Yep, it's time to look at some patterns. Now, I know a lot of fans who loathe the idea of trying to find patterns with release dates, and I'm kind of inclined to agree. Every remake was in a generation double its original number is true, but on its own feels more coincidental than meaningful. However, I do think there's logic behind which years we've gotten remakes. The first remake we ever got, Fire Red and Leaf Green, released 8 years after the original Red and Green. By the way, I'll be using the Japanese release dates for consistency here. Then, Heart Gold and Soul Silver released 10 years after Gold and Silver. The original games, Red and Green and Gold and Silver, released 3 years apart from each other, while the remakes released 5 years apart from each other. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire released 12 years after Ruby and Sapphire. Again, we see 3 years between Gens 2 and 3, and 5 years between the Gen 2 remakes and the Gen 3 remakes. Things get a little different between Gens 3 and 4. Because Gen 3 included Fire Red and Leaf Green, there were 4 years between Ruby and Sapphire and Diamond and Pearl. Gen 4's remakes, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, released 15 years after their originals, meaning the time between the Gen 3 remakes and the Gen 4 remakes also increased, going from 5 to 7 years apart. Now, yes, anything can happen. For all we know, Arceus could shadow drop Gen 5 remakes tomorrow, like it dropped the Legends protagonist out of their original timeline. But there's a consistency to these releases that indicate that the time between remakes is intentionally increasing. This makes sense because the more modern a game gets, the more time needs to pass before it's even worth remaking. There's a reason why so many people thought The Last of Us 2 Remastered was absurd. It's a 2024 remaster of a high-fidelity 2020 game. If Gen 5 were to get remakes in 2025, it would be 15 years after the original, the same time between Gen 4 and its remakes. That isn't too outlandish, but it does seem less likely when we realize that we had our last remakes in 2021. There would be only 4 years between Gen 5 remakes and Gen 4 remakes, the shortest amount of time between any set of remakes yet. If we instead follow the pattern set by the previous remakes, we'd see that Gen 5 remakes are more likely to release in 2028, 18 years after their originals. This would at least give players more time between remakes, more time between the original games and its remakes, and ideally, more time for the developers to work on the remakes. Yes, this is based on a pattern in a situation where there is no obligation for anyone involved to follow it, but if we understand why this pattern exists, why it is happening, it makes sense to think that it will continue. But I do want to bring up Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee really quick. They are mainline games, according to Game Freak. Worse still, they do ruin our pattern. But if we include Let's Go in our considerations, we'll see that Let's Go released 4 years after Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, and Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl released 3 years after Let's Go. There have been a lot of remakes lately, and I'd say now is a perfect time to ease up on them. We'd also see that the only system to have more than one Pokémon mainline game remake on it so far is the Nintendo Switch, with both Let's Go and Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. If Gen 5 remakes released on the Switch, not only would there be a lot of remakes released in a short amount of time, but there would be a lot of remakes on a single system. Wouldn't it make more sense to wait for the Switch 2? I also believe that if any game were to defy any patterns to begin with, it would be something like Let's Go, not something like Gen 5 remakes. If anything, Gen 5 remakes are so standard and expected that most fans were shocked by the Legends ZA announcement in 2024. Let's Go, on the other hand, is an outlier, and there's a very high chance that we won't see another similar game like it again, precisely because it was made to capitalize on the older players who were returning to the franchise thanks to Go. It's not entirely unwarranted to exclude it from remake discussions, but whether we consider Let's Go's place in the remake sequence or not, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for Gen 5 remakes to crash land onto the Switch in 2025, or even onto the Switch 2 in 2026. I'd go so far as to say even 2027 is too early. And if the Gen 5 remakes were made in a highly unorthodox way, actually changing the core of the game and not just the battle mechanics, that would only be more reason for them to be released later rather than sooner, since the developers would need more time to complete them. The disclaimer here is that all of what I just said could be wrong. It's true. It's all speculation after all. But honestly, I just don't think there's a lot to be gained from Gen 5 remakes releasing in 2025 or even 2026 at this point. If we want the best chance to get the best possible version of Gen 5 remakes, we should hope it doesn't get released for another few years. In the meantime, Legends ZA will give Game Freak more opportunities to play around with the Legends format, and possibly prepare for even more exciting series entries down the line, Gen 5 and otherwise. What do you think about the Pokémon possibilities in 2025 and beyond? Do you think Gen 5 remakes have been skipped entirely? If so, do you think that's for the best? Or are you disappointed? Or do you think Gen 5 remakes will be on their way sometime in the future? And did you enjoy this style of video? Let me know if you'd like to see more speculation or casual, chatty videos from me. I'd love to hear your Pokémon thoughts, as well as video feedback in the comments. And please like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe if you want to see the videos I make next. I'm Otome Nikki, and I'll see you next time. Take care, and best wishes.